Day. Thank you for joining us for the fifth session of the Arab-Israeli conflict course. Today's we'll focus in on how Israel copes with strategic challenges and the rise of Pan-Arabism and Nasser. For those of you that are joining us for the first time, my name is Ellen Resnick, and I'm the Educational Programs and Outreach Manager at Classrooms Without Borders. Classrooms Without Borders is a premier provider of experiential professional development for teachers, educational leaders, and lifelong learners. CWB offers unique travel experiences and virtual learning opportunities enriched with academic literature, relevant content, and resources to enhance the learning experience. At CWB, we pride ourselves in offering a series of comprehensive learning opportunities with a breadth and depth of content that is both timely and timeless. Over the past 23 months, we have offered a wide array of virtual community programs to engage with experts on topics relating to Jewish history, Israel, the Holocaust, genocide, and hate. Thank you for being part of our community of learners. If you would like to make a donation to support our programming, please visit our website to donate online. And of course, I have the pleasure today of introducing our scholar in residence, Avi Ben-Hur. As our scholar in residence, Avi has lectured, taught, and facilitated workshops in the United States, Warsaw, Prague, Berlin, and Greece. Please send any questions you may have directly to Avi via the chat feature. He will do his best to answer them at the end of the presentation. And with that, Avi, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Ellen. So I just want to dispel all the rumors. It's absolutely true that Israel has been amassing forces on the Israeli-Ukrainian border. So don't be worried. We're not going to invade Ukraine. Okay, I just want to see if everybody's awake. Good afternoon, everybody. This is Avi. I'm sitting here in Jerusalem. It's nighttime. I have to tell you that from the start right now, that my internet is a bit spotty today. We're having some construction on my street, and I think they hit electrical wire. I'm not kidding. That part's not a joke. So I hope we don't lose each other here. And I hope I don't come out choppy. So let's begin. Where did we leave off? In our last session, we left off talking about the aftermath of Israel's war for independence and how it impacted the Arabs in the country. And this takes us now to 1949. The war is over, and Israel survived an existential conflict. Israel is now going to be dealing with absorbing a huge number of immigrants. I'll be a bit more precise. Within the first 3 years of Israel's statehood, Israel is going to double its population. In the first 12 years, Israel will triple its population. And this while simultaneously having to house and feed all these immigrants and also having to deal with significant military expenditures, security expenditures. One of the first things that's going to crop up, and this is directly related to our subject, is what's going to be the status of the Arabs living inside of Israel, who now, from 1949 forwards, have become citizens. This is an important question because we have to keep in mind several things. First of all, the Arabs who become citizens didn't ask to become Israeli. They found themselves in Israel, whether they want to be or not. And we're talking now in 1949 about approximately 170, 180,000 Arabs. They constituted at that time something to the tune of maybe 12, 13% of the overall population. And by Israeli law, in theory, these Arabs who become Israeli citizens at the time were supposed to be equal citizens, equal rights. The reality on the ground is a little bit different. Let's try to understand what we're talking about over here, because this also speaks to the situation till today, to a certain extent. Let's start with the fact that many of the Arabs who found themselves as citizens of the state of Israel in 1949 had fought to prevent the establishment of Israel. Okay, this is number one. Number two, they were reeling in the wake of the fact that you had, as we said last session, you had something to the tune of 750,000 of their brethren had become refugees. So this is something that also impacts them. Some of the Arabs who become Israeli citizens were actually displaced within the state. In other words, they were not living in 1949 where they were living in 1947. Okay, I'll give you one example of what I'm talking about. in the north of Israel, and what's known as the Upper Galilee, very close to the Israeli-Lebanese border, there were two Christian Arab villages, Ikrit and Biram, who were literally sandwiched between Lebanese and Israeli forces. Israel asked them to evacuate their villages with an explicit promise that they would be allowed to return. Fighting took place on their lands between Israeli troops and Lebanese troops. But at the end of the war, they were not allowed to return to the villages. It was a militarized zone. And the truth is, till today, 2022, they were not allowed to return to the villages. They became Israeli citizens. They live in other parts of the Upper Galilee, but not in the original lands, the original villages. And that's just one small example. But what I'm trying to say now is that you had Arabs who became citizens who were actually displaced within the country. Let's keep in mind that they had family ties, social ties, and to a certain extent political ties with enemies of the state of Israel in 1949. And therefore, they were perceived by the state of Israel in 1949 as a potential fifth column. It was very clear because the Arab states that invaded Israel during the war in 48 made this clear that they were waiting for another round. They were licking their wounds and they're waiting for an opportunity to start another war with Israel. So what does Israel do? We have these citizens who constitute, as we said, maybe 13% of the citizens of the state of Israel, who were perceived by the state of Israel, whether this is justly or unjustly, were perceived as a potential fifth column. And therefore, what Israel is going to do is Israel is going to have a policy whereby Israeli Arabs will be ruled under military rule within the state of Israel from 1949 to 1966. What is it described to you is that for the first 15 years of Israel's existence, the Arab citizens, were under a military rule. What does this mean? It means that, for example, there were curfews. There after 6 in the evening, you couldn't leave your village or your town. There was limitation on movement, freedom of movement of the Arab citizens. Without a doubt, there were certain professions that were totally closed to Arab citizens. So what I'm describing to you right now, ladies and gentlemen, is a situation where you have a democracy, where in theory, by law, you have equal rights, but in practice, first 15 years, that was not the case. Now, if any of you please don't go crazy, because if I were to give you a parallel situation, what was going on in the United States in those same years, let's say with African Americans, and this doesn't justify, and it's a different situation, different context. You had plenty of citizens of the United States who didn't have equal rights. If that's voting rights until 1965, think about what under Lyndon Johnson. If we're talking about voting rights, we're talking all kinds of things. So what I'm trying to say is two wrongs don't make a right. But in Israel, looking at Israel as a democracy, that emerged in 1949, you had a sector of the population who were citizens but did not, for sure, have equal rights. By law, they did. In practice, absolutely not. What's interesting is what happens during this period with these citizens and what ends this period. What happened in 1966 to change things? Because 1966 in Israeli history is a random year. In fact, nothing happens in 1966 that's that important in Israeli history except for this. 67, something big happens in Israeli history, but this is a year before then, and it has nothing to do with what happened in 67. Now, before we even get there, I want to show you how what I talked about played out in a traumatic event that's going to take place in the 1950s, in the mid-1950s, within the context of what I just talked about. And I don't know how much you guys are aware of this story. End of October, or to be precise, the 29th of October, 1956, on the eve of the outbreak of the Second Arab-Israeli War. Those of you who are not familiar with what I'm talking about, 29th of October, 1956, we have a war that the Arabs called the Suez War, and basically, and we're going to get to that in a little bit, Israel partnered up with Great Britain and France, basically attack and invade Egypt. Okay, this happens in 1956. On the eve of that operation, we call it an operation, but it really was a war, Israel places a curfew on all of the Arab Israeli towns and villages in the country. In a fairly large Arab Israeli village called Kafr Qasem, they didn't get the memo, meaning Israel publicized this, but there were people who were out working in the fields, mostly an agricultural community, working out in the fields, and they were not notified that there was a curfew. They were not notified they had to be in their homes by whatever it was, 6 p.m. And you had Israeli border police who were located around that area. And I should say, by the way, Kafr Qasem was at the time quite close to the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, or if we look at it in terms of today, it was quite close to what's known as the Green Line, okay? And therefore, it was a sensitive area geographically. Therefore, there were border police in the area. The border police saw farmers returning after the curfew to their homes, and they opened fire, okay? And they killed over 50 civilians. I'll say it again. Israeli border police, the policemen, okay, who were around the area, perceived Arabs from Kafr Qasem returning home after the curfew. They didn't even know there was a curfew on. And the Israeli police shot first and asked questions later, and they killed over 50 people. Okay, this is a massacre, basically, not a deliberate one. And it was initially covered up because war breaks out less than 12 hours. But it became apparent what had happened, and it was a significant snafu. It was a screw up. This is not something that was deliberate. This was a mess. This is a mistake. And essentially, two things are going to emerge from this. The first, and what you see here on the screen in front of you, in the upper right-hand corner, you're seeing an artistic rendition of this done by an Arab artist of the bodies being laid out. And in the left-hand corner, what you're looking at is basically, it's in Hebrew, but you're looking at a newspaper headlines talking about, here you have the border police that are on trial. They were put on trial. And although they were found to be at fault and negligent, and they committed a crime, they basically got very little more than a slap on the wrist. And even those who got some prison time, the prison time was very, very short. Okay, so this was not a good sign. Okay, and what happens is, and this I want you to look very carefully on the top here, what you can see here, that during the trial, the justice that was ruling on the case said, look, there is such a thing as a manifestly illegal order. If your officer tells you shoot a baby, there is not a single reason in the world that an Israeli soldier should shoot a baby. That's considered a manifestly illegal order. And not only is the soldier allowed not to fulfill that order, he or she is obligated not to fulfill the order. It's a manifestly illegal order. Okay, and this is what I translated roughly from the Hebrew, what the justice said at the time, 1956. The distinguishing mark of a manifestly illegal order is that above such an order should fly like a black flag, a warning sign saying prohibited. Okay, and so what emerged from this became this whole trauma and snafu became actually part of what Israel called, in the Israeli military, they called purity of arms. It was something that was taught in all the commands courses of that there are certain orders that you cannot give, and soldiers are obliged not to follow them. Things that are blatantly illegal. Okay, and these are things that, again, I gave a very extreme case: shooting a baby. There's no reason in the world ever to shoot a baby. It's simply no one can find any kind of justification ever. It's kind of obvious, okay, but it's kind of like, the famous expression, I don't know how to define pornography, but I know what it is when I see it. Okay, I'm not sure one can define exactly what's a manifestly illegal order, but you know what it is when you see it. Okay, that's kind of a paraphrase on a paraphrase. So the idea here is that this is a big deal, and this became a black mark. And here's the thing: it was only in 2014, so this took place in 1956. It's only in 2014 that the state of Israel, manifested at the time by Israeli President Reuven Rivlin, went to Kfar Qasim, okay, and this was 58 years after the event, and apologized in the name of the state of Israel for this massacre. Okay, look how long it took this to play out. This is 1956. 1956 is just about midway, almost midway, in that 15-year period that I mentioned that the Israeli Arabs were living under military rule. Okay. This question that I raised, which was what happened in 1966, that the Israeli government decided to essentially cancel, okay, this military rule. And the answer is Israeli democracy couldn't sustain it. In other words, at some point, there was no pressure from the outside world, okay? And it wasn't like Israeli Arabs were up in arms. Essentially, what's going to take place is people in the parliament said, look, this is unsustainable in a democracy. We can't have a situation where the government is randomly putting curfews on citizens just because they're Arab, okay? Or they're limiting freedom of movement. Or you're saying, well, you can't be a doctor, or you can't. But there are certain professions that were literally closed. They were officially or unofficially, but in reality, were closed to Arabs, okay? And it's basically broke down, okay, because democracy was getting stronger as an idea, and it couldn't sustain this. This is why it happened in 1966. It took that long for it to happen. It was not pressure from below, from the Arabs, and it wasn't something external pressure. It was an internal pressure among Israeli Jews who said, enough's enough. Okay, we can't sustain this. And this idea of the Arabs being a potential fifth column, well, you know what? It's 15 years now, and they really haven't proved to be a fifth column. So we need to calm down, okay, and to start to treat them more like equal citizens. Now, I don't want you get the wrong impression that starting from 1966, it became Shangri-La for Israeli Arabs. But I am saying to you that you began to have a change, a significant change. Okay, so we began with this, and now I'm shifting, okay, to a broader picture, and I want to look at what does the leadership look like on the Israeli side and on the Arab side. Okay, so all of you, of course, are familiar with David Ben-Gurion. He was Israel's first prime minister, and he was a very, very long-running prime minister, although you can see he had a 2-year hiatus in 1953 and 1955. That's something that probably many of you either don't know or don't remember. Okay, for 2 years, from 1953 to 55, Moshe Shalet was the prime minister of the state of Israel. And Ben-Gurion had retired, but he was nipping at his heels and undermining Shalet from the outside. And at the end of the day, Shalet wasn't able to sustain himself that way with Ben-Gurion constantly undermining from the outside. And he had to step down in 55, and Ben-Gurion, but there's also something that took place in that period of time. There was let's say a big scandal, which we're going to talk about as well. Okay, and Ben-Gurion is going to replace him once again and will be prime minister again from 1955 to 1963. So we have in Israel political stability. Now, as Americans, you may say, wait a second, how can you have a prime minister from 48 to 53 and then once again from 55 to 63? Okay, in the United States, you've got a maximum a president could be is 2 terms, 2 4-year terms, 8 years. That's true. I'll remind you that happened after FDR. FDR was president for 4 terms. He didn't complete his 4th term, but he was elected 4 times, one after the other, and he died in his 4th term. Okay, and it's only after FDR that it was legislated in the United States that a president can only have 2 terms of 4 years each. Okay, so if you will, in the broader scope of U.S. history, it's relatively new. Think what I'm saying now. In the broad scope of U.S. history, it's relatively new that the president is limited to 2 terms of 4 years. There are no term limits in Israel, and this is part of the public discourse that's been going on now, especially in recent years. Okay, as we had Benjamin Netanyahu actually was prime minister for slightly longer than Ben-Gurion. Okay, and there have been a lot of talk now. There's been a lot of talk recently in the last 2-3 years of legislating term limits in Israel as well. But thus far, it hasn't passed muster, and therefore we don't have term limits yet. So getting back to my point, you have political stability. Okay, notice you have a clear leadership, which is the same leadership. In contrast to what's happening with the Arab states surrounding Israel. Here, I hope you guys can hear me because it says to me here that my internet connection is unstable. So I hope you guys
You
can hear me
froze for
okay.
just a second, but you're back for me good now.
Okay, I don't know where you guys, I hope you guys didn't lose me, but I saw that I was having a problem with that. Okay, hopefully you guys can hear me now. Before we start talking about the Arab leadership, I want to remind you something. The war breaks out in 47 between Arabs and Jews in British Mandate Palestine. We said in earlier sessions that the Jews defeated the Arabs. I didn't say Israelis, there's no Israel yet, on the eve of Israel declaring independence. When we get to the 13th or 14th of May, 1948, the Jewish community has defeated the Arab community in British Mandate Palestine. The British leave, Israel declares independence, and then Israel is invaded by 5 Arab states, 5 Arab armies. When the war is over in 1949, the Palestinians, as any kind of political force, leave the stage for the next 19 years. They have no power politically. They're going to be, from an Israeli perspective, a nuisance. We're going to talk about that today, but they're not the main players. And when you look at the Arab-Israeli conflict from 1949 until 1967, it's not a conflict between Israelis and Palestinians. It's a conflict between Israel and Jordan, Israel and Egypt, Israel and Syria, Israel and Lebanon. Okay, not Israel and the Palestinians. Palestinians are not on the stage at that point. Okay, so that's important as we take a look at the Arab players. I'm starting, with your permission, with Jordan. And here we have a very interesting personality, King Abdullah I, who basically ruled independent Jordan from 1946, when Jordan received independence from Great Britain, until 1951, when he's assassinated in Jerusalem on the Temple Mount. Now, I said that he is going to rule as king from independence in 1946, but in reality, King Abdullah is ruling Transjordan, or the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, from 1920 until 1951. So he's been there, it was there for 31 years. And the reality is that Abdullah had pretty good relations with the Zionists up until 1948. And in fact, to a certain extent, he got dragged into the war, but he's also one of the big winners in 1948 because he succeeds in capturing East Jerusalem, including the Temple Mount, which is the third holy site to Islam, okay, and the West Bank. In that sense, he's one of the big winners of that war. What's interesting is before the war and during the war and after the war, Abdullah was talking to the Jews and then later on to the Israelis. And the Jews turned into Israelis. There was a direct, not indirect, there was a direct line of communication. Golda Meir met him on the eve of the war and during the war. Okay. And there are all kinds of rumors that around 1950, 1951, Abdullah was working towards creating a peace treaty, a peace agreement with Israel. And that is the context, ladies and gentlemen, of his assassination by a Palestinian on the Temple Mount, or the Haram al-Sharif, if I speak in Arabic, okay, which is the third holy site to Islam, being accompanied by his grandson, Hussein, who watched his grandfather being assassinated in front of his eyes. Abdullah, the first son, Hussein's father, was mentally unbalanced. He had serious mental issues, and he could not replace Abdullah. He was deposed rather quickly because he really was mentally imbalanced. And Hussein becomes king at a young age, like 16 or 17 years old, when he becomes king. Okay, a very, very young ruler. And he's going to be ruling for decades. And his relationship with Israel ultimately was very good, but for quite a long time was not good. Okay, and we'll talk about how this plays out in the 1950s between Israel and Jordan in a moment. Another ruler who's going to emerge in the 1950s is Gamal Abdel Nasser. Nasser was the most charismatic and serious of the Arab leaders in his day. We're talking about somebody who was an officer in the Egyptian army who fought the Israelis in 1948, went back to Egypt, and he participated in a coup d'etat, in a coup that deposed King Farouk in 1952. So in fact, Nasser will become the president of Egypt from 1952 until 1970. Also quite a long period of time. Nasser was a very charismatic leader, as I mentioned, in the entire Arab world, not just the Egyptians. And he posed a huge problem, not just for Israel, but actually for the United States. Why for the United States? Because I have to remind you folks that we're talking about the Cold War, where the US and the Soviet Union are jostling for spheres of influence in the Middle East as well. And the truth is that up until 1955, the Soviets couldn't get their foot in the door in the Middle East. The Middle East was either in the US pocket, meaning, or within the US sphere of influence, if we're talking about Turkey, if we're talking about, believe it or not, Turkey, believe it or not, Pakistan, okay, believe it or not, Iraq, okay. Egypt was not within the US sphere. Nasser was kind of maneuvering between the United States and the Soviet Union. And ultimately, it's going to be Nasser, for reasons of his own, who is going to allow and enable the Soviet Union to enter through the front door and to leapfrog into the Middle East and to become a serious player and rival of US influence during the Cold War in the Middle East in the 1950s and 1960s. Nasser is going to be the player who is going to enable the Soviets to do that. So that which becomes very threatening to the United States as well. So again, a charismatic leader, a serious leader, okay, and somebody who became a threat not just to Israel but also to the United States in his day. So how do things play out between Israel and the Arab states in the 1950s? It starts out the following. You're going to have already in 1949, and it's going to be picking up steam in the early 1950s, you're going to have Palestinian refugees who are going to try to return to their homes. You're also going to have Palestinians who are going to try to come and attack Israel. And so Israel is going to be attempting to solidify its very porous borders. And we're going to have a whole series of terror attacks, most of which in 49, 50, 51, but actually the truth is most of them are going to take place after the assassination of Abdullah I. They're going to emanate from Jordan, or to be more precise, in the West Bank. Okay, and you can see here on this map on the left-hand side, okay, where the attacks are coming from to Israel. Here we're looking at the West Bank where my cursor is. We have attacks coming from Jordan, okay, and initially we're not talking about Jordan supportive of these attacks. We're talking about Palestinians on their own initiative who are going to be launching attacks. You're also going to have attacks launched, please note, in the bottom left, you're going to have from the Gaza Strip, which is basically under a military occupation of Egypt. And again, the initiative is not going to be Egyptian, but Nasser will be supportive, ultimately, of these terror attacks. So you're having terror attacks emanating primarily from Jordan and from Egypt-controlled Gaza Strip into Israel itself. And very, very quickly, the Israeli response is going to be to hold responsible the sovereign states there, if it's Jordan or Egypt, for what's being done from their territory. Even though Israel knows that initially, at least, it's not Jordan per se or Egypt per se, okay, that is sending these people, the Israeli, first of all, Israel has to have a target here. Israel has to hold somebody responsible for this, because it can't be something that you're getting attacked and you can't actually focus on the attackers themselves. And basically Israel said, listen, it's coming from your territory, the Egyptians coming from your territory, Jordanians, you're responsible and you're going to pay the price. Okay. And what's ultimately going to happen, okay, is that what's ultimately going to happen is that Israel is going to attack Jordanian and Egyptian military and police installations, kind of reprisal and punitive attacks, in order to force the Jordanians or force the Egyptians to rein in this terror. And in fact, it doesn't work. Okay, it doesn't work. And we're talking about a lot of tit for tat, up and back. Just to understand, it's within this context that you can have the creation of a special unit, okay, called Unit 101, which is established by Ariel Sharon, who was then an officer, a major in the Israeli army. And they're basically going to go on these kind of cowboy reprisal attacks, okay, and not just attacking, let's say, Jordanian or Egyptian military or police targets, but they're also going to go for civilian targets, and they're going to do a lot of damage. And yet, at the end of the day, the sense is not succeeding in preventing these attacks through these reprisal raids. This now brings us to what's playing out with Egypt. And I mentioned the fact that Nasser ultimately is going to enable the Soviets to enter. But before this happens, what's happening is the British had major military bases, particularly around the Suez Canal. And the British and French had major interest, economic interest, around the Suez Canal. In fact, the French owned the Suez Canal to a certain extent, and the British, as I said, had major military bases. Nasser wanted them out. Nasser wanted to create the Aswan Dam, to create electricity, to create more income for his people. He also wanted complete control of the Suez Canal, again, more income for his country. And ultimately, he's pressuring the British to evacuate their bases. And this negotiation between Nasser and the United States in terms of this, we're talking about this during the Eisenhower presidency, in terms of getting a major loan from the US to build the Aswan Dam. And ultimately, when things are not going the way that Nasser wants, he's basically going to nationalize the Suez Canal. It becomes clear that as all this is taking place, the British and the French are negotiating, trying to negotiate with Nasser good terms under which to leave. And you're going to have a kind of maverick, unauthorized intelligence operation run by Israel in Egypt, which becomes a huge disaster. This disaster is known as the Lavon Affair of 1954. What happens? Evidently, the Mossad, it's not quite clear, but the Mossad, basically Israeli intelligence, is going to utilize primarily local Egyptian Jews to commit sabotage on British and French, and later on American civilian targets in Egypt, to try to make it look like, okay, these are Egyptian terror attacks on British, French, and American targets, in order to prevent the British from evacuating their bases and the French pulling out, and so on and so forth. This ring was uncovered. It was totally unclear who authorized this. This was under the premiership of Moshe Sharet, who definitely did not authorize this. Became his nightmare. His minister of defense was Pinchas Lavon, who denied any knowledge of this, but was forced to resign. And this unfortunate affair was a big black spot on Israel. It didn't look good. And some of these Egyptian Jews were hanged. Some of them spent many, many years in Egyptian prison. This is a big disaster that takes place in 1954. Ladies and gents, at the end of the day, what's going to happen is Nasser gets fed up, and he does two things. Number one, he's going to nationalize the Suez Canal. And number two, he is going to sign an arms deal with Czechoslovakia in 1955. You understand, as we talked about the Czech arms deal with Israel during the War for Independence in 1948, the USSR had to give a green light to Czechs to sell these arms. And essentially, by Nasser cutting this deal with Czechoslovakia in 1955, basically, Nasser was enabling the Soviet Union to enter the Middle East through the front door. Israel found this to be very threatening because it totally upset the military balance between the two countries. The kinds of material that was being promised, being sold to, and being promised the Egyptian in terms of tanks and planes and artillery and missiles and so on and so forth was something that Israel perceived as completely shifting the balance, the military balance of power, at least in terms of material, in favor of Egypt. At the same time, ladies and gentlemen, the nationalization of the Suez Canal was something that really, as we say in diplomatic language, pissed off the British and the French. And so we're going to have a collusion between, a secret one, between France, Great Britain, and Israel. They're going to coordinate an attack on Nasser's Egypt in 1956, what's known as the Suez Campaign. By the way, this whole thing lasted 8 days, not more than that. It went from the 29th of October, 56 to the 8th of November. Okay. Sorry, 6th of November. It was 8 days. And basically the French and the British are going to be bombing Egypt, and Israel is going to send the troops into the Sinai Peninsula. The chief of staff at the time, okay, was none other than Moshe Dayan. Okay, this is 1956. In 1967, in the Six-Day War, he's going to be the Minister of Defense. And now he's the chief of staff. He's running the show over here. And ultimately, what's going to happen, as you can see on these maps, the Israeli troops are going to cut through the Sinai Peninsula, and they're going to get all the way to the Suez Canal. Essentially, what I'm trying to tell you is Israel conquers the Sinai Peninsula. Okay. This collusion, or this coordination, or this alliance between Israel, Great Britain, and the French was news to the United States. And again, really pissed off Eisenhower, who demanded immediately that the British and the French pull out, and also that Israel pull back from the Sinai Peninsula. Ladies and gents, this is a very interesting moment in international relations, because this moment in 1956, when Eisenhower said jump, the French and the British said how high, meaning the British and the French pulled back after they got a diktat from the President of the United States. And this, ladies and gents, is the end of the era of imperial Great Britain and imperial France, meaning this is the American century. And the British and the French wake up to a reality that, with all due respect, they're no longer empires. They're no longer superpowers either. So they pull back. Israel is going to spend a little bit more time in Sinai, and until Israel realizes that it's not a good idea not to listen to Eisenhower, and Israel will pull out of Sinai. Winners and losers in the Sinai campaign. You may be surprised to hear this, but one of the big winners is Nasser. In the perspective, Nasser, by the way, did not back down. Nasser fought back. He lost militarily, but he won politically. In the eyes of the Arab world, the fact that Egypt stood its ground against the British Empire and France and Israel together, that gave him a lot of gravitas, that gave him a lot of credit, as I say, street cred in the Arab world. Okay, this is very important for us to keep in mind. So Nasser was a big winner in this sense, and not just in the Arab world, but in what's known as the non-aligned states. Those states, African states, Asian states, didn't want to be either on the US side of the Cold War or the Soviet side of the Cold War. He becomes a significant leader of the non-aligned states, and this is a story which really popularized him, okay, in the third world. So Nasser, big winner. Israel, not big winner, but winner. In what sense? Well, first of all, this is the first time the Israeli army is acting after War for Independence and is able to do something fairly significant with paratroopers are being parachuted, okay, behind the lines, okay, and actually able to coordinate the force quite well. The attacks, the terror attacks that had emanated from the Gaza Strip stop after this operation until 1967. So you have quiet. You've got quiet on the Egyptian front. Very, very important. Big losers, the French and the British. And, ladies and gents, to a certain extent, the United States. Despite the fact that Eisenhower forced the French, the Brits, and the Israelis to pull out, at the end of the day, when this war or this campaign is over, Egypt is clearly within the Soviet camp. Despite everything I said a moment ago about the so-called non-aligned states, at the end of the day, the reality is that the Soviet Union gets more deeply and deeply ensconced in Egypt in particular and in the Middle East in general. Okay, because parallel to getting more involved in Egypt, they're also getting involved in Syria. Okay, so the Soviet Union is now here, is now in the region, and is now a major player. And this is also something that's very important to keep in mind. Please note, the Palestinians are not part of the story whatsoever. And this is also important for us to keep in mind when we take a look at all this. So the Suez Campaign, 1956, is, for the Israelis, it's something where they're able to prove we are actually a modern army. We're able to get some quiet on the Israeli-Egyptian frontier or border. Okay, we also have proper passage of Israeli shipping to the Suez Canal, something that Nasser had been interdicting and making problems. Okay, one of the things that emerges from this campaign is that Israel does have proper passage of ships, which we should have had in any case, up until 1967 when things are going to go awry again. So in that sense, the Suez Campaign, from an Israeli historical perspective, is considered to be fairly successful. Where are the Jordanians in all this story? They're really not. But because Nasser, his prestige and status rises in the wake of this campaign, King Hussein of Jordan, this young king, finds himself more and more forced to play ball with Nasser, forced also to bend when Nasser wants to bend him, despite the fact that very often he'd prefer not to get into that situation. Okay, so let me take a look at the questions that have come in. Okay, as I mentioned in the previous sessions, my goal is to keep these sessions in terms of what I do frontally to about 45 minutes. Okay, and then over to Q&A. I think that'll be good for everybody. So, interesting question. Was anyone physically in Israel automatically a citizen in 1949? That's a good question. I guess the answer is, if you were somebody who was a resident in Israel in 1949, you were a citizen. If you were a tourist in 1949 in Israel, it didn't make you a citizen. If somebody who's living in the country at the time, okay, officially, then yes, you basically became a citizen automatically. What was the status of the Druze in 1949? Very, very good question. I guess I did not mention the Druze, maybe I did, when I talked about the War for Independence. Let me now say a few words about the Druze. In 1948, some of the Druze in the country sat the war out, but there were Druze who took the Arab side and fought on the Arab side. And you had in an area called Mishmar Emek and Ramat Yochanan some significant, serious battles between Israeli troops and a Druze battalion. The Israelis just barely beat the Druze. And when there was a separation of forces and both sides were licking their wounds, with Israel having gained the upper hand, the Druze did one of these things. The Jews are going to win this war. We're on the wrong side of this, and they crossed the line. And the Jews actually, during the war, crossed over and asked to join the Israeli army. It's very interesting. in the early 1950s, so first of all, the Jews who were in the state of Israel in 1949 became, of course, citizens like other Arabs. But in the mid 1950s, the Druze religious leadership in Israel turned to the state and demanded that the state legislate mandatory conscription for all the Druze male, all the male Druze. And till today, male Druze have mandatory conscription, just like Israeli Jews do, and their participation in the Israeli army is as high as the Jewish participation. Excuse me. Okay, I'm being asked a question about this is not relating to what we discussed in this session, but I don't mind jumping in here. Okay, so there was an 80-year-old Palestinian American, okay, who was, the way they're putting it, he was killed by Israeli soldiers. This happened a few days ago. The details around this are not clear. It's not being kept under wraps. It's simply not entirely clear what the details are. But the reality is that there is pressure now from the United States, because he was a U.S. citizen, for Israel to investigate it properly, and therefore it's going to be investigated. This is not a pretty story. I would say that the question here is what has been the Israeli governmental and public reaction to the killing of an 80-year-old Palestinian American by the Israeli army? The truth is that if not for pressure from the United States, I don't think there would have been a lot of pressure. It really has not been on most of people's radars, I think, in Israel. It's on my radar, but it's not on most people's radars, because I think that what people right now, it is what it is. I'm being very truthful and very transparent here. People right now in Israel are in the midst of this wave, the Omicron COVID wave right now, with a huge percentage of Israelis being infected right now, and that's what's primarily in the news feed. In other words, this news item has been pushed very, very quickly to the bottom of the news page, of the news feed, in contrast to the big story, which is still COVID right now. Once again, because we're just peaking now. The United States is just, my understanding, the United States is just past the peak. We're peaking right now. Literally this week, we're peaking with infections and serious cases and so on and so forth. And therefore, this is not really taken center stage in the news feed. Okay. So I'm being asked by the same gentleman about this kind of brutality that has happened, and does it happen regularly? What kind of reactions? Look, I would say that this specific case is unusual. I can't think in recent memory of something like this happening, of somebody that old, okay, of being killed this way. You've had some fairly brutal things happen, not necessarily by Israeli soldiers, okay, by Israeli civilians, and some of these actions have had huge reactions in Israel. Don't want to make excuses. This is not pretty, but there is a struggle here, and which doesn't excuse anything, but there is a struggle here, and it's not pretty. I would say by way of context, but not by way of excuse, the second Intifada, which lasted from September 2000, end of September 2000, until about 2005, end of 2005, so almost 5 years, where you had so many Israeli civilians being killed by so-called suicide bombers and other terror activities. It basically created a reaction within Israeli society that was being brutalized by it, a reaction of having less care or concern for these kind of activities. Okay, it doesn't mean that it's not everybody. Okay, it's not any kind of activity, but certainly it's something that
Oh no, I think we lost Avi.
threats. Okay, and how Israelis then began to perceive even Israeli actions as a response. Okay,
You
this is
froze
no way.
halfway in between that answer. I apologize.
Say it again.
You froze in the middle of that answer.
Okay, I don't know which part I should repeat right now. Without boring everybody here, I'll try to repeat again. What I'm saying is, in my opinion, not by way of excuse or justification, okay, but in my opinion, the second Intifada, which lasted from end of September 2000 to 2005, okay, where so many Israeli civilians were murdered by suicide bombings and Palestinian terror, one of the reactions has been, and it's still deeply in Israeli society, is having less care and concern when Israelis perpetrate things that are not kosher from a general perspective here. And this is not in any way to make any kind of excuse, but rather to say this is in fact the reality on the ground. Okay. Okay. Being asked a question here: why did Eisenhower force the withdrawal? Egypt was not an ally of the United States. Correct, David. Egypt was not an ally of the States, but the United States was trying very hard not to enable the Soviet Union to enter through the front door. I want to remind you again, things that you've forgotten, maybe more of you, because all of us lived through the Cold War, that the Cold War, particularly in the 50s and 60s, not only, but 50s and 60s, was a Cold War that could easily turn into a hot war. And there was a big rivalry and struggle over spheres of influence. And the reality on the ground was, until 1955, 56, the Soviet Union had absolutely no sphere of influence in the Middle East. Now, this is difficult for us to recall because we all remember just how much impact the Soviets had in the 60s and 70s, how they were the main military supplier, right, of Egypt and of Syria and so on and so forth, and caused a lot of trouble with their meddling. When we get to the Six-Day War, we're going to talk about how the Soviets actually, to a certain extent, created the conflict there. They were a trigger for that conflict. That having been said, up until 55, with the Czechs arms deal, and then the Suez campaign in 1956, the Soviets were not there, and the United States didn't want them there. And therefore, Eisenhower thought that if he forced the withdrawal, the Egyptians would now, if not move into the American sphere, would not move into the Soviet sphere. And that was a miscalculation. It didn't play out that way. Okay, so again, it's not winning back Egypt, but it's trying to prevent Egypt from entering into the Soviet sphere. Did the Suez campaign damage U.S.-Israeli relations for a period of time? Yes and no. We have to be very careful and cautious not to project backwards of the good relationship Israel and the United States have shared for many, many years now to what it was in the 1950s. I have to remind everybody here that the reality on the ground was, from a military perspective, the United States only became supportive of Israel starting from the late 1960s. In the 1950s, the United States was friendly to Israel, but was no less friendly to the Arab states, and in fact did not perceive Israel as an important enough player. Okay, and we have to keep this in mind, and particularly in the Eisenhower administration. But even after Eisenhower, okay, when you look at Kennedy, JFK, he had a lot of he had a fair amount of criticism of Israel, tried to prevent Israel from becoming a nuclear power, okay, and it happened under his watch to a certain extent. So, we have to be careful not to project backwards on that. And on the one hand, it didn't make the United States very happy with Israel. On the other hand, I wouldn't say that the United States sanctioned Israel to any great degree. The United States said pull out of Suez, and ultimately Israel pulled out of Suez, and that was that. Was any significant defense of Sinai by the Egyptians? 56. Look, let's understand something. From then till today, you didn't have, and you don't have a significant population living, Egyptian population or any population living in the Sinai Peninsula, which is basically one large desert. Most of the residents are Bedouin tribes who are kind of all over the place that are barely under the control of the Egyptians then till today. So in that sense, we're talking about the Egyptian army, not the residents of Sinai, but the Egyptian army that would be acting to slow Israel down. The Egyptians could not withstand an assault, a combined assault of Brits, French, and Israelis. Let's be serious here. Okay, so significant defense, not really, but they defended themselves. I mean, they were beaten, but they defended themselves. They didn't, they weren't fleeing, and that was important. Okay, and primarily it's not so much the military question here as much as Nasser was defiant the whole time. Whether he's being beaten or not, he was defiant, which is important. Okay, I'm being asked the question of how come the Palestinians were not involved in the Suez War, or where were the Palestinians living? What were they called Palestinians at the time? Look, the Palestinians, well, for the most part in the region, were most part refugees, whether they were refugees in Jordan, or Syria, or Lebanon, or in the Gaza Strip. The identity of the Arab citizens of Israel at the time, when they're internally for themselves, was more Palestinian than it was Israeli. And in terms of calling them Palestinians or not calling them Palestinians, I mentioned the fact that from a political perspective, they were not on the stage. So they called themselves Palestinians at the time, and the Arab states called them Palestinians or Palestinian refugees, but they were not significant politically at that time. They're going to re-enter the stage through the front door in the wake of the Six-Day War in 1967. And when we get to that, we will expand on that. Okay. All right. I'm being asked to comment on Tantura in 1948. So the question from Bilha or Bilha is relating to a news item that was publicized this week. And it was publicized this week because of an Israeli film that was shown in the Sundance Film Festival called Tantura 1948, if I'm not mistaken. And basically, the article that came out this week and the documentary that I've not yet seen, that's also being shown now, is referencing specifically to evidently a massacre of Arab POWs, or people who raised the flag already, that took place during the War for Independence in 1948. So I'm being asked to comment on it. There's nothing really for me to comment on. In the war in 1948, like every war that I know of anywhere, there were mutual atrocities that took place. Okay, and you have to look at this with open eyes. For me, it's not very surprising, okay, because this is what happens in war. This, again, not to justify making excuses, but this is exactly what happens in war. War is chaos, and bad stuff happens in war. And yes, Israeli Jews also committed atrocities in 1948, okay? So did the Palestinians on the Israelis, so did the Arabs and Israelis, and the Israelis did it to Arabs as well, okay? To some extent, it was tit for tat. In other extent, it just is part of what happened during the war. Again, without justifying it, okay, or making excuses for it. And the story of Tantura, where people with the Arabs who've been defeated there, some of them raised the white flag or had already been captured and evidently were shot, okay, after they shot, meaning they were massacred. And we're not talking about 5 people, we're talking about quite a few people. And evidently they were buried in a mass grave, okay, which is under the parking lot and the beach there today. That's the story in a nutshell. I don't have a lot to comment about it because it's not the sole example. There are plenty of other examples one could point at of things like this that took place in 48, both on the Israeli side and on the Arab side, okay? This is not to say that two wrongs make a right, but this is to say that a lot of bad things happen during war, in every war, in any war, including the Israeli wars as well. Okay, what was taking place in Israel and Syria in this time period? Stay tuned for the...
No, Avi, you froze again. Sorry.
I said there's a question here about what was going on between Israel and Syria during this time period, and the answer is, if you guys can hear me now, the answer is that I will stay tuned. I will be talking about that in our next session because it's a lead up to 67. It's important to follow it that way. So I'm going to answer one last question here with your permission, guys. What is Israel's reaction to what's taking place between the Russians and the Ukrainians? Israel's official reaction is we may have to evacuate Ukrainian Jews from Ukraine. Aside from that, Israel's staying mum. We're not there. It's very, very far from us geographically. We have no way of impacting it. Okay. I think a bigger question would be for me to ask you guys, you're sitting in the States, how do Americans perceive this story right now? How are Americans looking at it? If you ask me, as both an American and an Israeli, and somebody who has 2 degrees in international relations, I would say that we are at a very, very serious inflection point in America and international relations right now. Because if Putin gets his way, if America and NATO back down and Putin gets his way in Ukraine, I guarantee you that we're going to see in the not too distant future China doing something similar in Taiwan. Okay? And the idea here, as far as I can see it, is that powers like Russia and China are directly challenging the world order that we had since the end of World War II until 5 minutes ago. They're basically saying to the United States, listen, this is not your backyard. Ukraine is not your backyard. Taiwan is not your backyard. It's in our backyard. Russia or China's, okay, mind your own business. We're going to do what we want to do. We're the power. We're the superpower in that area. That was something unacceptable, okay, theoretically unacceptable. Let's remember the Prague Spring. Let's remember what happened in Hungary, 56. But let's say theoretically that was unacceptable. And the United States tried to prevent those kind of phenomena. And there was a certain world order that was acceptable. That world order may be collapsing in front of our eyes. So stay tuned. Okay, folks. We will meet again in another month for another session. I hope that you enjoyed this one. I'm sorry about the internet issues. I'm hoping that that's going to be rectified next time we meet. Again, doing some work on my street here, and I hit some electrical. We've been having problems with internet in my home all day long, and I seem to be having it now. Want to wish everybody good health. Ellen.
Fantastic. Thank you, Avi. I'll formally close us out for today. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you, Avi, for today's session. As Avi mentioned, our next series will be held next month. It is on February 22nd, same time, 2 p.m. The topic is on the 6 Days War. We also hope that you'll join us for future events in the coming weeks. We have an author talk this afternoon, starting at 4. Rebecca Donor will speak about her book, All the Frequent Troubles of Our Days. And again, if you or your family would like to sponsor an event, please reach out to us directly. Stay safe, stay healthy, and we hope that we'll see you all again soon. Bye, everyone.